The Galactic Empire's Mistake. The gleaming spires of New Geneva stretch toward the artificial sky of Kepler 442b, humanity's newest colony world. 8-year-old Maya Chen pressed her small hands against the observation deck's transparent aluminum, watching the twin suns cast dancing shadows across the terraformed landscape below. Her dark eyes sparkled with wonder as she counted the cargo ships descending from orbit, each one bringing supplies and new families to their growing world. "Look, Papa!" Maya pointed excitedly at a particularly large vessel. "That one's got the red stripes like Uncle David's ship." Dr. James Chen smiled, adjusting his daughter's position so she could see better. As the colony's chief xenobiologist, he'd spent the last 3 years helping transform this barren rock into a thriving human settlement. Maya had been just 5 when they'd arrived, and watching her grow up among the stars filled him with pride he'd never known possible. The peaceful moment shattered when the first plasma bolt struck the colony's outer shield generators. Alarms screamed across the settlement as massive shadow fell across the observation deck. Maya gasped, her small body trembling as she looked up at the enormous Zephyrian dreadnought that had materialized overhead. The ship's hull stretched nearly 2 kilometers, its dark metal surface pulsing with hostile energy signatures. "Emergency evacuation protocols activated," the colony's AI announced in its calm, measured tone. "All civilians report to designated shelters immediately." James scooped Maya into his arms, feeling her tiny heart racing against his chest. Around them, other families rushed toward the emergency exits, their faces pale with fear and confusion. The Zephyrian Empire had maintained an uneasy peace with humanity for over a decade. There had been no warning, no declaration of hostilities. As they reached the shelter entrance, another plasma strike hit closer to the residential district. The building shook, and Maya buried her face in her father's shoulder. "Why are they attacking us, Papa?" she whispered. Before James could answer, a new voice echoed across the colony's communication system. It spoke in perfect human standard, but carried the distinctive harmonic undertones of Zephyrian vocal cords. "Citizens of the human colony designated New Geneva," the voice announced. "You have 30 standard minutes to evacuate this world. By decree of Emperor Vex Thalar the Magnificent, this system now belongs to the Zephyrian Empire. Any humans remaining after the deadline will be considered hostile combatants and dealt with accordingly." James felt his blood turn to ice. 30 minutes wasn't enough time to evacuate even a fraction of the colony's 40,000 residents. The transport ships could maybe take 5,000 at most, and that was if they had hours to organize proper departure procedures. "This is Colony Administrator Sarah Martinez," came the desperate voice of their leader over the comm. "We demand to speak with your commanding officer. We are peaceful civilians, including women and children. This unprovoked attack violates every interstellar treaty." "Your treaties are irrelevant," the Zephyrian commander cut her off. "Emperor Vexathala requires this system for strategic purposes. Your presence is no longer tolerated." In the shelter, Maya tugged at her father's sleeve. "Papa, what's happening? Are the bad aliens going to hurt us?" James knelt down, taking his daughter's small hands in his. Around them, other parents struggled with similar conversations, their voices tight with barely controlled panic. The shelter's walls vibrated with each impact from above, dust raining down from the reinforced ceiling. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said honestly, "but I promise I'll keep you safe." A young mother nearby clutched her infant son, tears streaming down her face. "My husband's still at the mining station," she sobbed. "He doesn't even know what's happening." James recognized her as Lisa Park, whose family had arrived just months ago seeking a fresh start after losing everything in the corporate wars on Mars. Her husband worked the overnight shift at the deuterium extraction facility in the Northern Hemisphere. "The evacuation ships are launching now," someone called out, monitoring the emergency frequencies. "But they're targeting our departing vessels." The words hit the shelter like a physical blow. Through the comm system, they could hear the panicked voices of transport pilots as Zephyrian fighters harassed their escape attempts. Several ships had already been destroyed, their debris raining down on the colony's outskirts. Maya pressed closer to her father, her small voice barely audible over the chaos. "Papa, I'm scared." "I know, baby, I know." The 30-minute deadline approached with merciless precision. Outside, the sounds of destruction grew louder as Zephyrian ground forces began their systematic dismantling of human infrastructure. Power grids failed, casting entire districts into darkness. Water treatment plants exploded in brilliant fireballs that lit up the artificial sky. "Attention, remaining humans," the Zephyrian commander's voice returned, now carrying an edge of cruel amusement. "Your time has expired. By imperial decree, this world is now under Zephyrian control. Any resistance will be met with immediate termination." James felt something fundamental shift inside him as he held his trembling daughter. This wasn't war between military forces or competing governments. This was the deliberate, systematic destruction of innocent lives for no reason other than imperial convenience. The first human screams began echoing across the comm system as Zephyrian soldiers entered the civilian shelters. "Please," Administrator Martinez's voice crackled through the static. "We have children here. Whatever your empire wants, we can negotiate." The transmission cut to silence. Maya looked up at her father with eyes too old for her 8-year-old face. "Papa, are we going to die?" James Chen had spent his entire adult life studying alien ecosystems, learning to understand and appreciate the vast diversity of life in the galaxy. He'd raised his daughter to see the beauty in different species, to embrace the wonder of a universe filled with countless forms of consciousness. But as he held Maya in the darkness of their failing shelter, listening to the systematic murder of their neighbors and friends, something ancient and primal awakened in his chest, something that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity or diplomatic protocols. "No, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice carrying a promise that seemed to resonate beyond the confines of their small hiding place. "We're going to survive this, and when we do, the people who hurt our friends are going to learn something very important about what happens when you threaten human children." Maya nodded solemnly, not fully understanding her father's words, but sensing the steel beneath them. Neither of them knew that their conversation was being recorded by the shelter's emergency systems, or that those recordings would eventually make their way across the quantum communication networks to Earth. They couldn't have imagined that Maya's frightened question and her father's quiet promise would spark a response that would reshape the balance of power in their corner of the galaxy. Above them, Zephyrian soldiers continued their methodical work, confident in their overwhelming superiority. Emperor Vex Thalar had chosen this remote human colony specifically because of its isolation and strategic value. The local human government would file protests, perhaps impose economic sanctions, but ultimately, they would accept the loss as an unfortunate reality of galactic politics. The Zephyrians had studied human behavior extensively. They knew humans were generally peaceful, preferring negotiation and compromise over direct conflict. Even when provoked, human responses were typically measured and proportional, guided by complex moral codes and international laws. What they hadn't studied closely enough was human history. In the darkness of Shelter Complex C, James Chen continued holding his daughter, both of them listening to the sounds of their world dying around them. Neither spoke, but both were acutely aware that their lives had changed forever in the span of 30 minutes. Maya's childhood had ended the moment those first plasma bolts struck. James's faith in galactic civilization had died with Administrator Martinez's final transmission. But in the ashes of their old lives, something new was taking root. something that would soon teach the Zephyrian Empire why, throughout human history, those who had made the mistake of threatening children had rarely lived to regret it. The recording systems continued their faithful documentation, preserving every word and cry for posterity. Within hours, those files would begin their journey to Earth, carrying with them a simple message that would change everything. They had threatened a human child. Earth's response was already being written in the silence between father and daughter, in the promises whispered in the dark, in the ancient fury that awakened whenever humanity's young were endangered. The Zephyrians thought they knew humans. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. Earth's Awakening. The emergency session of the United Earth Council convened at 0300 hours Greenwich Standard Time, just 18 hours after the first distress signals from New Geneva had reached the Sol system. The massive holographic display in the center of the assembly hall showed the last confirmed image from Kepler 442b, Zephyrian dreadnoughts hovering over the smoldering remains of human settlements like vultures over carrion. Admiral Sarah Knox stood before the assembled representatives, her weathered face reflecting decades of military service and a controlled fury that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Behind her, the casualty reports continued scrolling in stark white letters against the black background. 40,000 civilians presumed dead, including 8,000 children. The Zephyrian Empire has made a grave miscalculation, Knox began, her voice carrying clearly through the absolute silence of the chamber. They believe they understand humanity based on our diplomatic protocols and peaceful expansion policies. They see our preference for negotiation as weakness, our respect for civilian life as a limitation. President Elena Vasquez leaned forward from her position at the council's head table. Admiral, what's the current status of our colonial fleet? Scattered and mostly defensive, Madam President. The Zephyrians struck during our demilitarization phase. Most of our colonies have minimal defensive capabilities, exactly as outlined in the Galactic Peace Accords. Councillor Wang from the Pacific Federation shook his head grimly. Accords the Zephyrians apparently consider meaningless. How many other colonies are at risk? Knox manipulated the holographic display, highlighting 17 star systems in ominous red. Our intelligence suggests these are potential secondary targets. The Zephyrians seem to be implementing what they call strategic territorial consolidation. A euphemism for genocide, muttered Dr. Yuki Tanaka, Earth's leading xenobiologist and, coincidentally, former colleague of the late Dr. James Chen. She'd received his final data transmission just hours before the attack, a routine report about soil composition that now read like a message from the grave. President Vasquez stood slowly, her movements deliberate and measured. Counselors, we face a choice that will define humanity's place in this galaxy for generations to come. We can file diplomatic protests, impose economic sanctions, and hope that galactic pressure will force the Zephyrians to negotiate. Or, she paused, letting the weight of the alternative settle over the assembly. Or we can show them exactly why Earth's history is filled with dire warnings about what happens when someone threatens our children. Councillor Brighton from the European Alliance frowned. Madam President, are you suggesting military action? The Zephyrian Empire has over 300 star systems, and a fleet that outnumbers ours 20-1. Admiral Knox stepped forward, her expression shifting to something that could only be described as predatory. With respect, Councillor Brighton, you're thinking about this wrong. The Zephyrians have 300 systems to defend. We have one objective, making them regret what they did to New Geneva. You're talking about a war we cannot win, Brighton insisted. No, said Dr. Tanaka quietly, her voice carrying an odd certainty. She's talking about a war the Zephyrians cannot survive. The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Admiral Knox nodded slowly, accessing a classified file that materialized in the holographic display. The image showed a sleek, predatory-looking vessel unlike anything in the current human fleet. Project Prometheus, Knox announced. For the past 5 years, a joint military-civilian consortium has been developing what we call next-generation strategic assets. The program was authorized as a contingency against exactly this type of scenario. The ship in the display rotated slowly, revealing weapon systems and propulsion technology that clearly surpassed anything in known galactic arsenals. But more disturbing was the ship's registry, dozens of identical vessels, all listed as construction complete. How many? President Vasquez asked simply. Currently operational? 47, in final testing phases, another 38. And Madam President, these represent only the first wave. Counselor Brighton's face had gone pale. You're talking about weapons that could destabilize the entire galactic balance of power. The balance was destabilized the moment Zephyrian plasma bolts struck a human kindergarten, Knox replied coldly. Everything else is just consequence. Dr. Tanaka accessed her own files, displaying genetic and psychological profiles that filled the chamber with uncomfortable data. The Zephyrians made their decision based on outdated assessments of human behavior. They studied our diplomatic history, our peace treaties, our preferential resolution of conflicts through negotiation. What they failed to study was our evolutionary history. Images flashed across the display. Predatory pack hunters, tribal warfare, extinction events that had forged humanity in the crucible of survival for millions of years. Humans are not naturally peaceful, Tanaka continued. We became peaceful through conscious choice, through the recognition that our natural inclinations toward violence needed to be channeled constructively. But that choice is contingent on reciprocal respect for the fundamental values we hold sacred. And chief among those values, President Vasquez added quietly, is the protection of our young. The recordings from New Geneva began playing automatically, filling the chamber with Maya Chen's frightened voice, asking her father if they were going to die. The sound of her 8-year-old fear cut through the assembly like a blade, and several counselors visibly flinched. The Zephyrians killed 40,000 people, Admiral Knox stated flatly. But more importantly, from a strategic standpoint, they killed 8,000 children in front of their parents, and they broadcasted across our communication networks as a demonstration of power. She paused, letting the full implications settle. They have no idea what they've just awakened. Counselor Brighton made one last attempt at diplomatic reason. Surely there's another way. The Galactic Mediation Council, Dr. Tanaka interrupted, will spend the next 6 months debating jurisdiction while the Zephyrians consolidate their position and prepare for their next expansion. Meanwhile, 17 more human colonies lie in their projected path of conquest. President Vasquez called for the vote with the weight of history heavy in her voice. All in favor of authorizing Operation Prometheus with full strategic discretion granted to Admiral Knox and the Joint Military Consortium? The vote was unanimous. As the session concluded, Admiral Knox remained behind, staring at the tactical displays that showed Zephyrian fleet positions throughout their empire. Her aide, Commander Harrison, approached cautiously. Admiral, the Prometheus fleet can be ready to deploy within 72 hours. What are your orders? Knox turned to face him, and Harrison was surprised to see that her expression had shifted from controlled fury to something far more unsettling. Calm satisfaction. Commander, send a message to the Zephyrian Emperor through official diplomatic channels. Tell him that the United Earth Council formally protests the unprovoked attack on New Geneva and demands immediate reparations for the loss of civilian life. Harrison blinked in confusion. Ma'am? I thought we were... We are. Knox smiled, and the expression was deeply uncomfortable to witness. But first, we're going to give them a chance to realize their mistake and attempt to make amends. It's important that the historical record shows we offered them the opportunity to resolve this peacefully. And if they refuse? Nox turned back to the tactical display, her fingers tracing the locations of major Zephyrian population centers. Commander, have you ever studied Earth's military history, specifically the campaigns of William Tecumseh Sherman during the American Civil War? I'm afraid not, Admiral. Sherman understood something that modern military theorists often forget. The most effective way to end a war quickly is to make it so costly for your enemy that they lose the will to continue fighting. He didn't just defeat Confederate armies. He destroyed the infrastructure and resources that supported those armies. Harrison began to understand. You're planning to target their supply lines and industrial centers. I'm planning to target their civilization, Nox corrected calmly. The Zephyrians want to play by conquest rules? Then they'll learn what happens when humans play that game. We're going to dismantle their empire piece by piece, system by system, until the mere mention of humanity makes their children wake up screaming. She called up another display showing the Prometheus ship's projected capabilities. Commander, what these vessels represent isn't just advanced technology. They represent 5 years of preparation for a war we hoped would never come. Every simulation, every contingency plan, every worst-case scenario we could imagine. And now? Admiral Nox's smile widened, and Commander Harrison found himself stepping back involuntarily. Now we implement all of them. Across the solar system, the Prometheus fleet began its final preparations. Crews who had trained in absolute secrecy for years finally learned the true nature of their mission. Weapon systems that existed only in classified files came online for the first time. Strategic plans that had been theoretical exercises became operational reality. On Earth, the children slept peacefully, protected by the vast machinery of human civilization and unaware that their safety had just been purchased with the promise of unprecedented vengeance. The Zephyrian Empire had 48 hours to respond to Earth's diplomatic protest. Admiral Nox already knew what their answer would be, and she was looking forward to delivering humanity's reply. The reckoning Emperor Vexathalar the Magnificent regarded Earth's diplomatic protest with the casual dismissal of a being accustomed to absolute power. In his throne room aboard the Imperial flagship, surrounded by holographic displays showing the successful occupation of the former human colony, he dictated his response to a trembling aide. "Tell the humans that their protest has been noted and filed appropriately," he said, his forearm gesture indicating the waste disposal unit in the corner. "If they wish to discuss terms for the return of their surviving colonists, all 67 of them, they may petition for an audience through proper diplomatic channels." The aide hesitated. "Your Imperial Magnificence, our intelligence reports suggest the humans may be preparing some form of military response. Perhaps it would be wise to consider—" Vexathalar's laugh was a sound like grinding metal. "Military response? From the species that spent the last decade reducing their fleet to glorified cargo haulers in the name of peaceful exploration, let them come. Their pathetic vessels will make excellent target practice for our gunners." The Emperor had good reason for confidence. The Zephyrian military machine had conquered 43 species over the past 3 centuries. Human technology, while adequate, was decades behind Zephyrian capabilities. Human tactics were defensive and predictable. Human psychology favored negotiation over confrontation. Everything the Empire knew about humanity suggested they would ultimately accept the loss of New Geneva as regrettable but unavoidable, just as they had accepted smaller territorial disputes in the past. Vexathalar had studied the human response to the attack carefully. Their council meetings, their diplomatic protests, their emergency sessions, all perfectly predictable reactions from a species more concerned with appearing civilized than actually defending their territory. He was still laughing when the first Prometheus ship materialized in the heart of the Zephyrian home system. The vessel appeared without warning, its stealth technology rendering it invisible to every sensor array in the Imperial fleet until it chose to reveal itself. It hung motionless in space just outside the orbit of Zephyr Prime, broadcasting a simple message on all frequencies. This is Admiral Sarah Knox of the United Earth Fleet, aboard the UES Retribution. By order of the United Earth Council, the Zephyrian Empire has been found guilty of crimes against humanity and crimes against children. Your civilization is hereby sentenced to dissolution. You have 1 hour to begin evacuation of civilian populations. Vexthalar stared at the message display in disbelief. One ship, one human ship, was threatening the entire Zephyrian Empire. "Destroy it!" he commanded. His fleet commanders immediately began coordinating the attack. 3 full battle groups, over 200 warships, converged on the human vessel's position. Energy readings spiked across the system as the Empire's most powerful weapons charged to full capacity. The Retribution waited patiently as the Zephyrian Armada approached, making no effort to evade or defend itself. At optimal firing range, the entire fleet opened fire simultaneously, unleashing enough destructive energy to vaporize a small moon. The energy beams struck some form of barrier around the human ship and simply stopped. Not deflected or absorbed, but negated entirely, as if the very concept of the attack had been rejected by reality itself. "Impossible," breathed Vexthalar. Admiral Knox's voice returned to the communication channels, carrying a tone of mild disappointment. "Your response has been noted and filed appropriately. You now have 58 minutes to begin civilian evacuation procedures." The Emperor's rage finally overcame his shock. "All ships, continuous bombardment. Reduce that vessel to atoms." For the next 7 minutes, the Zephyrian fleet poured every weapon in their arsenal against the lone human ship. Plasma cannons, particle beams, fusion torpedoes, gravitic mines, an endless barrage of destruction that should have obliterated anything conceivable. The Retribution remained completely unharmed. When the firing finally ceased, not from any tactical decision, but because the Zephyrian ships had begun overheating from continuous discharge, Admiral Knox's voice returned with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. "I'm afraid you're not understanding the situation. Allow me to clarify." The holographic displays throughout the Zephyrian fleet suddenly activated, showing tactical readouts that made no sense. According to the data, there were now 47 identical human vessels positioned throughout the star system. Worse, similar readouts were appearing from every major Zephyrian system across the Empire. "The ships you see represent the first wave of Project Prometheus," Knox explained conversationally. "Each vessel is equipped with technology that your scientists will not be able to comprehend for approximately 3 centuries, assuming your species survives long enough to continue scientific development." Vexthalar's voice cracked as he finally understood the scope of what was happening. "What do you want?" "What I want," Knox replied, "is for the 40,000 people your empire murdered on New Geneva to still be alive. Since that's impossible, I'll settle for justice." The Emperor desperately tried to reassert control. "You cannot destroy an entire interstellar empire. The Galactic Council will do exactly what they did when your empire murdered human children. Nothing. But don't worry about the Council, your imperial magnificence. Worry about me." The first demonstration began at the edge of the system, where a Zephyrian mining station simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed by weapons fire, not consumed by explosion. It was there one moment and gone the next, as if it had never been built at all. That mining station processed raw materials for your military shipyards, Knox noted clinically. It employed approximately 800 workers, all of whom were evacuated to safety before the facility was removed. We're not monsters, after all. A second facility vanished, then a third. Each time, Admiral Knox provided detailed commentary about the strategic value of the target and the civilian evacuation procedures that had preceded its elimination. "You're wondering how we're doing this," Knox continued as another installation disappeared. "The short answer is that 5 years ago, human scientists made several breakthrough discoveries about the fundamental nature of reality. The longer answer is that you should have studied our history more carefully before you decided to threaten our children." Vexithalar's throne room filled with panicking advisors and military commanders as reports flooded in from across the Empire. Identical scenes were playing out in hundreds of star systems as human vessels systematically dismantled the infrastructure of Zephyrian civilization. "Please," the Emperor finally whispered, "what do you want us to do?" "I want you to understand," Knox replied, her voice carrying the weight of 40,000 graves. "I want you to comprehend exactly what you did when you murdered families and broadcast their deaths as entertainment. I want your entire species to remember this moment and pass it down to their children and their children's children." The methodical destruction continued. Military bases, industrial complexes, communication networks, all vanishing with surgical precision while civilian populations were evacuated to safe zones. The message was clear. Human technology could erase any target they chose, but they were choosing to preserve Zephyrian lives even while dismantling their empire. "Your species has 2 choices," Knox announced as the bombardment of the capital world's orbital installations began. "You can adapt to a new reality where the Zephyrian Empire no longer exists and where your people live peacefully under human protection. Or you can continue resisting, and we will continue removing the tools that enable your resistance until you have no choice but to adapt." Emperor Vexthalar watched his throne world's defenses disappear one by one, each loss demonstrating the complete helplessness of his position. His empire, built over 3 centuries of conquest, was being systematically reduced to its component parts by an enemy he had dismissed as weak and irrelevant. "How?" he asked finally. "How did we not know? Our intelligence services, our military assessments, were exactly what we wanted them to be," Knox answered. "Did you really think the species that conquered their own planet through industrial warfare would forget how to fight? We've been preparing for this day since we first encountered the galactic community. We just hoped we'd never need to use these preparations." The final phase began as human ships took position around Zephyr Prime itself, not to threaten the population, but to begin the systematic removal of government infrastructure. Imperial palaces, military headquarters, administrative centers, all vanishing in the same impossible way as their outer system installations. "The Zephyrian Empire is now officially dissolved," Admiral Knox announced. "All former Imperial territories are hereby placed under United Earth protection. Your people will be relocated to designated worlds where they will be provided with basic necessities and the opportunity to build peaceful, productive lives." Vexthalar found himself standing in the ruins of his throne room, his imperial regalia suddenly seeming like a child's costume. "And if we refuse?" Knox's answer carried the finality of a closing tomb. "Your imperial former magnificence, you don't seem to understand. Refusal is no longer an option you possess. The only choice remaining is whether your people learn to live peacefully under our guidance, or whether we need to provide more intensive supervision." Across the galaxy, the impossible had become reality. The Zephyrian Empire, one of the dominant military powers in known space, had been completely neutralized in less than 6 hours by an enemy they had considered militarily insignificant. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the human victory was not their overwhelming technological superiority, but their restraint. Throughout the systematic dismantling of an entire interstellar empire, human forces had killed exactly 0 Zephyrian civilians and fewer than 300 military personnel who had refused evacuation orders. The message was clear. humanity could have exterminated the entire Zephyrian species without meaningful resistance. Instead, they had chosen to preserve Zephyrian lives while eliminating their capacity for future aggression. On Earth, children slept peacefully while their parents worked through the night, processing refugee requests and preparing aid shipments for displaced Zephyrian populations. The same species that had just demonstrated the ability to erase civilizations was already organizing humanitarian relief for their former enemies. Admiral Knox's final transmission to the former Empire was broadcast across all channels, ensuring that every surviving Zephyrian would hear her words. To the people of the former Zephyrian Empire, what happened today was not vengeance. Vengeance would have been the complete annihilation of your species in response to the murder of our children. What happened today was justice, administered with the restraint that marks the difference between civilization and barbarism. She paused, letting the implications settle across 100 worlds. Your children will grow up in a galaxy where their safety is guaranteed by human protection. They will receive education, medical care, and opportunities for peaceful development that your empire never provided. In return, they will learn the most important lesson in galactic history, that some lines must never be crossed. The line you crossed was the deliberate murder of human children for political advantage. Every species in the galaxy now knows the consequence of that action. Your empire is gone forever, but your people will survive and hopefully learn to thrive under the guidance of those who understand the difference between strength and cruelty. This concludes Operation Prometheus. All human vessels return to patrol stations. Admiral Knox, out. In the silence that followed, Vexithaler looked around his empty throne room and finally understood the true lesson of his defeat. The humans hadn't simply outfought the Zephyrian Empire. They had demonstrated a form of power that made military conquest obsolete. They had shown the galaxy that humanity possessed both the capability to destroy civilizations and the wisdom to choose a better path. The former emperor of a vanished empire sat alone among the ruins of his ambitions, contemplating a future where his grandchildren would grow up as citizens of the very civilization he had tried to dominate. He found himself hoping they would learn to be worthy of the mercy they had been shown.